Hi, welcome to Exploring Sunday Scriptures for this week. This is August the 29th, and the scriptures that we are exploring is for this Sunday, September the 3rd, the first Sunday in September, coming up this Sunday. That means it will be a Holy Communion Sunday, so for those of you that do attend with us online, you want to make sure that you have everything nearby when you come to worship online, so a bit of bread or a cracker and some juice nearby so you can participate fully in worship if you will be attending online. And if you're here, of course, we have different options available for communion. This is the last week that we are going to be with the lectionary, as next week we begin a series which is focused on first pondering the dream that God has for us, and well, let's broaden that, for the world and for us specifically as a community and as individuals. We're calling it a Dreamcast session. So basically, what is the dream that God has for us, and what is the dream that we would be proud to have been a part of? So we're going to be exploring that scripturally, and we'll then also have a conversation following worship next week on September the 10th to see if the Spirit is really guiding us collectively towards some ambition in ministry. Then we will, in the series that follows, be somewhat loosely related to the book that will be part of our adult spiritual formation. Yours are the hands of Christ, the practice of faith. And this is really going to take our dream casting and look at the application, the doing of it. So the book makes reference to the different aspects of what we do with our hands in faith, starting with praying and being introspective, but then also loosening those hands and reaching out. So part of also realizing sort of whatever that dream might be. This week, we're still with the lectionary. So if you recall, just a little reminder, the lectionary is a 3-year cycle of readings comprised of Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, New Testament, so the story of the early church, all of those things outside of the Gospels, which is the story of the life and ministry of Jesus, and it has one of those as well. There's also a recommended psalm for each of the Sundays, which can be incorporated as one of the scriptures or as a call to worship, or in other ways as those laying out worship may choose. Sometimes those scriptures coordinate well thematically, and sometimes they're really not thematically coordinated, but the lectionary moves us through reading the majority of the Bible over the course of 3 years. And so each of these stories is a way to do that, or each of these little passages is a way to do that. So we have been journeying for a little bit through Genesis and the story of Abraham and Sarah, and then Jacob, who becomes Israel, and then Joseph, his son. Now we're jumping into Exodus. So this is sort of the next chapter in the history of God's people. They had landed down in Egypt following a famine, and Joseph's placed there, and that's where they remain until Moses is called and leads them out of the slavery, unfortunately. So they fell out of favor and ended up as servants or slaves in Egypt. We continue to read from Romans. We are almost through Romans now, so this is considered Paul's most developed theology, written to a general audience of the Christians in Rome. And this year's gospel is the Gospel of Matthew, and now where we are in Matthew is a turning point in some ways, as you'll hear it referenced in this passage of Jesus really beginning in Matthew's gospel, in the arc of the gospel, his turn towards Jerusalem and the events that will happen there. So let's see what we can get out of these three, if there is a link between them, or if this is just giving us the next installment in each of these chapters as we ponder what the truth is that God is speaking to us through this inspired word for this week. So first from Exodus, this is chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And then God said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Excuse me. God said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I've also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this my title for all generations. So this is the incident of the burning bush and represents the moment of the call to Moses of the ministry that lies ahead. You could say that God here has cast a dream or laid out a course in this call of what Moses is going to do. And that's to lead the people. He's going to go to Pharaoh and say these things, and then he's going to lead his people to liberation and ultimately a reconnection with God on the mountain that God has laid forth, Mount Horeb. At least that's what's spoken here. Moses, as I think any of us would, he's just tending his father-in-law's flock, is saying now, why would people believe me? I'm just Moses. I don't have anything to offer. And how will they know that I've had this conversation, this call, this connection with you, God? And God says, you give them my name. And the name that God gives here is quite simply, it's a verb, but it basically means I exist. So when we get I am who I am, it basically is what we would call the to be verb, and it is a personal pronoun of I am. So I exist, or I don't know how else to put it, but it basically is a straightforward kind of answer of, it's not the name of a God that matters in the sense of a proper name, but simply the truth of God's existence. That's kind of God's name. I exist. I am. That's it. I am. There's lots of philosophers and theologians over the centuries that have used this as the foundation for their own philosophies or theologies related to the existence of God. That the fact that we can have the word God at all itself alludes to the fact that there must be that God exists. And so it's kind of a verification of God's name or the existence of God is by the very fact that we can even have a word, God. So those things being related. That's a very thin approach to the ontological argument or the deontological, those philosophical things, but that's kind of the idea behind it. Now, there's a lot of things that I think that this could speak to us without even looking at the other readings, such as pondering our own place when we doubt we have the capability to follow, perhaps where we're feeling nudged or led by the Spirit, or spoken to by God, perhaps more specifically, that sometimes those directions are challenging in ways that we can't conceive that we are the right person or the right community to do that. And yet there is God saying, I'm going to be with you. And that should be enough to carry us forward, no matter what the challenge that lies ahead of us, no matter if we reach that promised land, that place that we hope to get to, the justice that we hope might happen or not. At least we're making progress towards that. Let's shift over to Romans just to hear our second reading and see if there's more connections between these readings or if they really are separate realities. So this is Romans chapter 12, verses 9 through 21. These are some instructions from Paul on the behaviors that God's people, that Christians, the followers of Jesus, should abide by, that should be their way in the world. This is how Paul writes. Let love be genuine, hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection, outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal, be ardent in spirit, serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope, be patient in suffering, persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints, extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink, for by doing this you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. What I think this does is really set up the juxtaposition that God's ways are often counter or run counter to what human ways or maybe our self-centered inclinations might be. And so often when evil is done, when there is something that upsets us, what happens is we are retributive. That is, we go for the eye kind of justice scenario. This happened, and therefore this reaction is the counter to balance that. You did this thing to me, now I'm going to do this thing to you. And what's set up here is that God's ways are very different. You did this thing to me, but I'm still going to take care of you. I'm not going to allow that to change my way in the world. In fact, I'm going to show you that there is a different alternative. And this different alternative is really what is the hallmark of God's people. I think this is actually a nice connection into the call of Moses, in the sense of how God's people will be. It doesn't really connect with the sense of the flight out of Egypt per se and how the Israelite people will be differently. But I think that there is a deep connection, if you will, for how God's people are going to be different from the world around them and how the world will take notice of those things because they are so different. Hold fast to good, love one another. But it's really the end of this. Don't repay anyone evil for evil. Take thought of what's noble in the sight of all. As far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. These are really good, practical pieces of advice. And in some ways, I feel like these should be on the mirror in the bathroom each day to remind me as I approach each day how I am to be in the world. Or maybe, in the car, on the dashboard. Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. We have an opportunity by what we say and don't say, by what we do and don't do, to really live by and abide these ways of God. And so to be very reflective on how we are in the world and to make sure that it aligns with these things that Paul is saying. So very practical, whereas we have a narrative or a story about a point in time from the Old Testament, here's practical advice for any time from Paul, but a deep connection still of following God, following the one who is I am, who exists, means connecting ourselves into God's ways. What are God's ways? God's ways are different than ours, and so we aspire to them and dream of what our lives and our community and our world would look like as we aspire toward them and the impact they can have in the lives of others. We turn now finally to the gospel reading, Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 28. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great sufferings at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. But Jesus turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me, for you're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his reign. So we have an episode followed by a teaching moment. And the episode is indicative of classic Peter, if you will, who sticks his foot in his mouth. And here's another moment of that. And Peter's heart is in the right place. So Jesus is saying, look, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. And by virtue of going to Jerusalem, here's what's going to happen. They're not going to like what I have to say. They haven't liked what I've had to say and what I've been doing and the people I've been around. And that likely, Jesus doesn't say likely, but that is going to lead to my death. They're going to find a reason to put me to death. This is my future. I understand what is happening, and I understand that this must be, as I will show in not resisting that there is a way forward through love that encourages life to come forth out of death. So I'm paraphrasing or adding in a lot to that first part. Peter can't handle the idea of, losing his friend and his mentor and his teacher. And so when he says, hey, you got to stop saying these things, it is coming from a place where his heart aches at the idea of not having Jesus around, as any of our hearts ache when we think of the absence of a loved one or a friend, of their death. And so that's really kind of where he's speaking from, is that place. And why Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, is a reflection back to the temptations at the beginning of his ministry. That Jesus is facing a choice, and this choice, one path leads toward Jerusalem and death, the cross, and one path leads away from that, and that would be very self-serving. That would be to remain, to not call out, as he will through what will transpire in Jerusalem, the injustices of that system, and ultimately the justice or victory of God's love. If he ends up self-serving and says, forget it, let's not go to Jerusalem, let's just go off into the countryside and be left alone, it is self-serving for him and will never rock the foundations of the world in his offering. So it is a reflection back to those original temptations. And so his declaration of Peter as Satan is, don't tempt me down a different path. So temptations can come in a variety of forms, including those that perhaps have something good behind them. Peter is really thinking compassionately, but lead to a different outcome, and that outcome doesn't do the work and ministry of God. And Jesus kind of sets that, like you're thinking about things for yourself, and you're not thinking about things for God. And so we need to think about things for God, for what is going to do the most good for God. That's what's going to change the world for God. And he goes into then, and we can kind of, I think, pair this up with Romans and even Moses's call. But Jesus then says, look, if you're going to follow me, it's going to be a hard path. You're going to have to deny things that might be easy for you or you would be inclined towards. And instead, you're going to have to be compelled towards something that you would otherwise totally avoid. So that's why he refers to, if you want to become my followers, let you deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. The other thing I want to point out in this is, yes, crucifixion was a well-known death, but everything written in the Gospels is written retrospectively. The end of the story is already known. So did Jesus really say, take up your cross and follow me? It's difficult to know whether that is a reflection that Jesus dies of crucifixion, and so as the story is written from the beginning through to there ends up being little pieces that perhaps Jesus did say, if you're going to follow me, it's going to be in ways that are different than the world. Did he say, take up your cross and follow? Hard to say, as that seems reflective eventually of the death that he will face himself. But he does here in Matthew's, in this passage, he does say that. I don't think it loses its potency or its meaning at all if this is an editorial addition by the author of Matthew to say cross. The idea is still the same. You're going to have to do things that are contrary to what your mind may be set upon. So as you set your heart on God, you're going to have to deny that easy path. You're going to have to go a different direction. And as you go that different direction, that leads you into the heart of God, into God's blessings. So those are our three passages this week. I think there's a lot of potency in each one. There is, I think, some overlap between each of them. So they could be woven into a homily, which is what is the common thread between all of the passages. But it would also be pretty easy to focus on any of those three uniquely, as I think that they all have something that could be used on their own without a need to pick and pull from the other two. Sometimes when you take on too much, you kind of lose some of the core of what's there. So I encourage you to go back to these passages, to read them again before Sunday, to ponder to yourself, where are you hearing the nudge of the Spirit in these? Are there particular words that really make your ears tickle, if you will, or things that are standing out for you? Underline those, maybe highlight them, take note of them. That could be some nudge of the Spirit in the sense of how God is working on you through these inspired words. Passages again are Exodus chapter 3 verses 1 through 15, Romans chapter 12 verses 9 through 21, and Matthew chapter 16 verses 21 through 28. I look forward to being with you in worship this Sunday as we seek out the Holy Spirit's guidance in these scriptures and God's message for us as we come into the month of September. God bless. Take care.